Welcome back to everyone. I'm your host, Stephen Teskey, retired judge. Now, if you've been following my In Defense of DEI series on my Substack, or that is this podcast, Justice Redesign, you know we've spent months dissecting the quiet, systemic dismantling of our nation's civil rights infrastructure. Now, we've talked about the historical necessity of DEI. We've talked about the difference between formal equality on paper and substantive justice in the real world. But today, we reach the conclusion of this series, and we have to be direct. We have to be honest, because we're currently witnessing a spectacular, shameful effort to turn civil rights law entirely on its head. Now, with the stroke of a pen in Washington, D.C., starting way back in March of 2025 when President Trump took office, and with a series of aggressive rulings from the Supreme Court, the legal tools designed to protect marginalized minorities are being systematically re-engineered to shield the majority and protect the status quo. Now, they're doing it all under this beautifully marketed, highly seductive banner, and that is colorblindness. Okay? Now, before we dive into the dry legal mechanics, let's look at how this is being sold to the public. Recently on his network, Dr. Phil aired a segment that perfectly captures the cultural grievance driving this anti-DEI movement. The show focused on a white student named Brooks Warden, who claimed that he was bullied, harassed, and physically targeted at school for wearing a MAGA hat, and harboring conservative views. Now, I say, that he claimed. I have no doubt that he was. Okay. But let's look at the actual context here. The school that Brooks Warden attended in Austin Independent School District was a majority minority school. It was predominantly Hispanic and politically liberal middle school. In that localized, smaller micro environment, he was a demographic and political minority, and he faced real interpersonal friction and schoolyard bullying. But I want us to look at how Dr. Phil framed it. You see, Dr. Phil didn't just address schoolyard bullying. This wasn't just what it really was, schoolyard bullying. Okay, let's be clear. All right. And it's always wrong, illegal, and should be stopped by school authorities with absolute determination when a student like Brooks is being bullied. Okay. All right. But instead, what Dr. Phil did is that his episode validated the student's experience as a textbook case of systemic, widespread, nationwide anti-white racism. Okay? Now, this is the narrative pivot that the opponents of DEI rely upon. But folks, I got to tell you, as a former judge, let me inject some reality-based discipline and psychological honesty into this conversation. First, let us ask a painful, necessary question. How can someone with Dr. Phil's clinical education, expertise in psychology, and deep background in teaching people to see through dysfunctional behaviors and frame their situations in functional ways or terms, choose to sensationalize a localized, tragic schoolyard conflict into an imagined national crisis? All right? I want you to think about that for a moment. All right? Was it pure ratings-driven drama? Or was he himself influenced by his own unexamined implicit biases? Look, I don't know, right? But it begs the question, because it doesn't make sense to me how you can take a local incident of schoolyard bullying and turn it into a national crisis as if white people are systemically being discriminated against on national scale. And this is the white elephant in the room, right? I mean, we all have implicit biases. I have implicit biases. No, even highly intelligent, highly functional people can act in profoundly dysfunctional ways when their blind spots are triggered. Let us be completely clear. It would be naive to suggest that white individuals never face acts of prejudice, unfairness, or discrimination. Okay? When an individual is mistreated because of their race or beliefs, it is wrong, it is illegal, and the law should absolutely protect them. In fact, we should take drastic, uncompromising action to protect the students because in that specific schoolyard microcosm, he was the minority. And I agree with Dr. Phil. This was an issue to take up. No doubt about it. Okay. This young man, Brandon, shouldn't be bullied that way. And bullying is a big issue. And many students who are bullied, from my vast experience sitting in the court dealing with schoolyard bullying, is just like this. Brooks is not alone. This is not an isolated incident that he went through. This is something common, whether you're black, you're white, you're brown, you're Indian, indigenous, okay? You know, the minority always gets bullied because there's something different about them when compared to the majority. But the mistake, the dangerous dysfunctional leap here, is equating that localized micro imbalance with a widespread systemic national campaign of discrimination against white people. That's where I believe Dr. Phil went off the rail. Now, I'm going to tell you something. I enjoyed Dr. Phil for many years, okay? He is very good at what he does. So don't get me wrong, okay? If you watch Dr. Phil, continue watching Dr. Phil, because I will tell you the vast majority of what he does is very, very well done and has helped a lot of people and is also his mass audience, helping them to think in different ways and more functionally than dysfunctional. So come on, folks. None of us are perfect, okay? And my criticism of Dr. Phil in this regard is no reflection on how a really good psychologist that he is. So I say keep watching him because I am, all right? But I want you to think about the power dynamics here, okay? My central thesis throughout this series is that in any pluralistic, diverse setting, an unchecked majority will naturally seek to overpower, silence, and discriminate against the minority. That is exactly what happened at Brooks School on a microcosmic, that is much smaller scale. But nationally, on the macro scale, right, the structural levers of power, wealth, and institutional authority are held by a historical white majority. Now, to pretend that what happened to Brooks in a majority-minority classroom represents a nationwide crisis of anti-white racism is a massive, misleading, false equivalence. Widespread systemic discrimination is not a matter of localized demographic friction or schoolyard arguments. It requires structural power. Widespread systemic discrimination is like Jim Crow laws. You know, it is redlining, is the generational structural exclusion of Black Americans from wealth, voting booths, jobs, and equal justice, the many lynchings that took place, most in the Southeast, okay? That's what I'm talking about. That's widespread systemic discrimination. Nothing happening to white people in America today remotely approaches that scale, right? Or depth, or historical brutality. So yes, let us protect Brooks at his school. But let us not use his local structure as a cynical excuse to strip away 60 years of civil rights protections designed to shield Black Americans and other people of color from macro-level catastrophic institutional discrimination. You see, by elevating isolated interpersonal conflicts to the level of a systemic national crisis, media spectacles terrify the majority. They make the majority feel systemically targeted, which is not what is happening, and weaponize that fear to dismantle the legal defenses of marginalized minorities. Folks, it is a political tool. It is taking advantage of these isolated incidences and turning it into something that it isn't. It's a lie. We're tearing down the firewalls designed to prevent widespread discrimination against Black Americans, all to appease a manufactured sensationalized grievance. And I'm not referring to Brooks' bullying being manufactured. For God's sakes, no. I'm talking about taking his injuries and harm, and they're real, and manufacturing a different grievance. And that is this, that white people are systemically discriminated against, like Brooks, and that it is somehow now institutionalized. No. But it also provides the perfect cultural cover for the radical legal restructuring that's occurring in Washington today. In other words, what I'm saying is that in that particular episode on Dr. Phil, Brooks' situation was taken to an imagined different level that's not really happening in reality. In other words, Brooks, in that sense, was a puppet. And that's harsh, okay? But that's really what's going on in this very politicized world now of race and politics. Now, this cultural grievance also finds its ultimate legal justification in the chambers of the Supreme Court, specifically under the leadership of Chief Justice John Roberts. Roberts has long championed a doctrine, what is called formal equality. The belief that the law must treat everyone identically, regardless of the unequal reality on the ground. He famously wrote in 2007, "The way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race." It's a beautiful phrase. I mean, it really is, right? It sounds so simple. It sounds so fair, okay? But I'm just telling you again, as a former judge with legal experience in civil rights cases, before I took the bench, let me tell you this. It is dangerously, incredibly naive, the position that Chief Justice John Roberts and that particular majority is taking. It is an exercise in what I call merit without memory, stripping merit of context to produce a curated ignorance. It is treating a marathon as a fair race even when half the runners were held at the starting line for the first 2 hours. In the landmark 2023 college admissions decision, Roberts and the conservative majority used this logic to strike down affirmative action, ruling that the Constitution protects only individuals, not demographic groups. And more recently, the court has restricted the creation of majority-minority congressional districts, the gerrymandering case, claiming that actively drawing lines to ensure minority representation is itself a form of racial discrimination. Folks, this philosophy relies on a massive made-up, what I call bad facts. See, bad facts makes bad law. It presumes that our society has reached a point where we are completely colorblind and that the playing field is already level. Come on. Maybe us white people who's walking around may have a strong sense that racism has disappeared, okay? But we're not walking in the shoes of Black people and brown people and indigenous people, because their eyes are going to have a different focus. They're going to have a different perspective. They're going to pick up on discriminations that we as white people would not pick up. You know why? Because it's not happening to us. That's the reality. It still happens to them. Okay? They see it, they feel it, it's smart discrimination. It's what I call subtle discrimination. But they pick up on it because they're the victims. Why would we pick up on that when it's not happening to us? But we walk around thinking, oh, it's all okay. It's all over with. But when you sit where I sat, when you spend years on the bench watching how systems actually operate, you see that neutrality is often a mask. A cover. I've watched white systems smartly and systemically discriminate against people of color. I saw requirements, test structures, and hiring policies that never once mentioned race, yet were perfectly designed to yield racially exclusive results. The Supreme Court is telling us that we are legally forbidden to fix the tilt in the board because noticing the tilt violates the rules. And if you think that this is just an abstract academic debate, look at what happened on June 9th, 2026. In this month, the same month I'm producing this podcast. This is the story no one in mainstream journalism is really talking about. But it is the fatal blow. The Department of Justice's Office of Legal Counsel, now run by Todd Blanche, issued a binding opinion declaring that the EEOC's disparate impact guidelines are unconstitutional. Now, I want you to let that sink in for a moment, okay? What does that mean? Disparate impact guidelines are unconstitutional. Well, so what are they, for those who don't know? See, for 50 years, disparate impact was our primary tool to catch what I said earlier, smart discrimination. Discriminate in a way that no one will notice. It held that if an employer used a facially neutral policy, now on its face, looking at a piece of paper, let's say, doesn't look like there's anything discriminatory here. Seems like the process seems pretty neutral here, such as, let's say, a standardized test. Okay, standardized test, big deal. A credit check. Oh, we have to do credit checks. Or an automated AI algorithm that disproportionately excluded minority applicants absent a strict business necessity. You see, it was unlawful to do that. But those things were done. Standardized testing was done in a way that would exclude people of color. All right? We looked at the reality of the outcome, not just the theory of the process. But now the DOJ has ruled that this tool is unconstitutional. They argue that looking at disparate outcomes pressures employers to use race-based quotas, which they claim discriminates against white applicants. They have walked right into the reverse discrimination trap. You remember that episode? I hope you saw it. Okay, in my essay on it, on the reverse discrimination trap, which is collapsing the difference between systemic process reform and identity preference to freeze inclusion in place. You see, by dismantling disparate impact, the DOJ has effectively ruled that unless a plaintiff can produce a smoking gun, explicit written proof of malicious racial intent, that's the smoking gun. A discriminatory system is perfectly legal as long as it is facially neutral. They have turned the shield into a sword, folks. As this corporate chill settles in, companies like Goldman Sachs are quietly removing their public diversity targets to manage their legal exposure, right? But they're not abandoning the system. Remember that episode? I shared with you the website of Goldman Sachs, the site on their site that talks about how we still honor diversity and inclusion, even though they got rid of DEI and those type of acronyms that the present administration doesn't like. But they can't abandon it. You know why? Because they know that inclusion is what you do. Diversity is what you get, and equity is what you sustain. Because they know they're a business, and that inclusion, making a place where you work feel safe by making people feel like they're included, will in and of itself produce diversity. Okay? It automatically happens. You don't need a quota system. If you want to make profit, you have to have a diverse employee staff that can generate many diverse ideas that's going to compete in the marketplace and win out. Goldman Sachs knows that. They can't get rid of it because profit is their objective. Now, you could try to outlaw an acronym, but you cannot outlaw structured evaluations. You cannot outlaw standardized criteria to pick people. And you cannot outlaw the Tuskegee Airman reality that talent is distributed across all demographics. And when you build bias-resistant objective systems, that talent naturally becomes visible. That's what happens. True meritocracy, folks, does not mean returning to the good old days of country club pipelines and unstructured subjective gut hiring. That wasn't merit. That was proximity bias dressed up as professionalism. We have to ask ourselves, is this colorblind law grounded in reality? Look, human nature dictates that as long as we have diverse society and as long as a Historical majority holds the structural levers of power. We will need laws that actively ensure the minority has a decent opportunity to get hired, to be promoted, and to be represented. You know, folks, it is really naive to think that we've reached color blindness. It is very naive to think that in any pluralistic society like ours, where there's an historical majority, that discrimination will not occur. It will occur. That is human nature. Look at what happened to Brooks. It happened to Brooks at a micro level, right? Because he was in the minority. Ignoring race in a society where racial disparities persist is not color blindness. It is a willful, cowardly blindness. It is bad law designed to make people feel good while preserving structural privilege, because that's what this is all about. And when we reframe civil rights as harm and equality as excess, we arrive at the ultimate moral inversion, and it's this: grace for the oppressor. The last episode, the 2 parts. We're asked to extend absolution to those who impose injustice, to forgive the structure without repentance, while leaving the marginalized locked outside the gates. We cannot allow ourselves to be seduced by the illusion of the neutral default. We must have the courage to see the system as it is, to call out the subversion of our civil rights laws, and to keep our eyes wide open, even when the courts demand that we close them. Well, that will conclude our series, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank you for listening to this podcast on Justice Redesigned. I encourage you, please, to subscribe to receive my essays and podcasts, the moment that they're published. All you need to do is hit the subscribe button and enter your email address, and it will take you to another window that shows a menu of 3 options. Pick the no pay option, and it will take you to another window and ask if you want to download the Substack app. That's up to you. It's not necessary that you download to receive my publications, but without the app, you will not be able to access past publications because you have to get to my site, and the app helps you get to my Substack Justice Redesigned site. You may, however, enjoy the Substack website because you can find a diverse array of authors and podcasters on many topics, not just mine, that you may find interesting and enjoyable. But with that said, I want to close with this, okay? Keep questioning the narratives. That's what justice is all about, in reaching justice. Don't ever assume it's the truth. Question it. Keep demanding substantive justice. All right, I'm Steve Teskey, retired judge, and this has been Justice Redesigned. Until the next time, ladies and gentlemen, be safe and take care.